I'm going to call to stage Michael Henderson, who's research director of the Louisiana State University Public Policy Research Lab, who's going to share with us some data that has just been released, is going to be released right now, in fact, on some research on perceptions 10 years after the storm. Michael, good to see you. So take us through and help us understand a little bit what you've been measuring and what you found.
Yeah, so what we wanted to look at was, like you said, perceptions. We wanted to know how people are seeing, interpreting, experiencing recovery. There's a lot of great information that's come out recently, a lot more coming out this week on objective measures of changes, policy changes that help us understand the nature of the recovery in this region of the state. A lot of that's out there to be found. The data centers here, and they're just like my favorite thing on the internet. A lot of great data there. But we wanted to pair that. We wanted to add something to that by measuring perception, what people think, see, and experience. And so that's what we did. And what we found with respect to New Orleans, the thing that's leapt off the page for me is this enormous racial disparity in perceptions of how far the city's come.
So tell us what the data is. How are different communities seeing it?
Yeah, when we talk to white residents of New Orleans, about 80% of white residents of New Orleans say that the area is mostly recovered. But African-American residents of New Orleans, it's like 50 to 60% saying it's mostly not recovered. So this big gap in perceptions of sort of how far we've come. But we wanted to go a little bit beyond that because it's not always clear what the baseline is for recovery. Are you comparing to like the devastation right after? Are you better than that? So we asked a series of follow-up questions where we wanted to tap specific dimensions of these perceptions. And so one of the things we asked about is overall the quality of life in your community, but not the day after Katrina. How does the overall quality of life in your community compare to the summer of 2005 before Hurricane Katrina? And again, we find this large disparity. 50% of white residents of the city today say the quality of life of their community is better. So think about what that means. It's not better. They're not simply saying it's better than it was when the city was underwater. They're saying it's better than it was before the storm came. About another 30% say it's as good as. So altogether, about 80% of white residents think the quality of life in their local community is at least as good as, if not better than before the hurricane. You get the opposite when you look at African-American opinion in the city. You have about 50% of African-Americans in the city saying that the quality of life in their community is actually worse than it was in the summer of 2005. Before Hurricane
So how does
Katrina.
that shape the city and what it aspires to be? And we've heard from Mayor Landrieu, I think just an incredibly bold vision of what could happen, but really big challenges in violence, getting the right equation right so that people have jobs and opportunity. I just have to say, after being down here, and obviously this is a time that the country is taking a look at what's happening here, and the read that I get is there's a lot of fragility and nervousness when I look at what this is, which is hard. So when you look at these different categories of perspective about whether life is improving or not, what does that portend about the future and the decisions these different communities make?
Yeah, I think it poses a challenge, right? Because there's, New Orleans is a diverse community, and if the recovery is uneven and its benefits are not equitably distributed, that's going to create political challenges. That's going to create social challenges. It's going to create difficulties in sort of keeping the city together to continue the efforts that have been made here over the last 10 years. And I think there's a tremendous amount of evidence that these could be deep-seated fissures. We looked at a variety of reasons why there might be gaps, racial gaps in perceptions of recovery. So one of the things we thought was, we know the demographics of the city have changed, and a lot of folks have talked about how there's a sizable share, particularly disadvantaged communities, residents who weren't able to come back. But we also looked at who moved into the city that had not lived here before Hurricane Katrina. And as you would guess, based on the generic overall census data, it's a more socially, economically advantaged community. It's a wider community. So on average, white residents of New Orleans, of course, this does not speak to every single person, but on average, white residents of New Orleans tend to have shallower roots in the city because there's been a significant influx of folks who just moved to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. Whereas, by and large, most African Americans in the city today were here before the storm as well. So we think that's one reason, a different experience of the event. But we also know it's a different experience of the recovery. So we found, for example, that 70% of whites who returned to the city, who lived here before Hurricane Katrina and returned and live here today, 70% were back in their homes, not just in the city, but back in the residences they had before the storm within a year. Among African Americans, it's only about 44%. And then if you look, it's actually even worse if you look specifically at African American women. Only about a third of them who have returned to the city were able to be back in their homes, the homes they had, but within a year. And that's just looking at people who came back. That doesn't factor in the people who didn't. But the third reason is we think the experience of the things that have happened as part of the recovery and the rebuilding effort. So, for example, there's been a tremendous amount of economic activity. So in our data, we found that, by and large, most whites, 60% of whites, say that the economy is better in New Orleans today than it was in the summer of 2005. But a majority of African Americans say no. They say it's worse, that the economy, for them as they experience it, is not what it was.
So do you unpackage those attitudes in the African? Because if you look at the lineup today, or you read the papers, and it's full of vignettes, if you will, of stories of heroism, investment by black leaders, new institutional arrangements, self-help groups that have come in and changed the dynamic. That there are positive stories out there. Are those not having any impact on the bleak results you found? I mean, it's sort of interesting that either those are not having an impact on the overall aggregate perception, they're being ignored, or there's not enough marketing or self-awareness about the great stories that have happened in the community.
Right, I suspect it's a combination of all that. At the end of the day, what we can say for sure is it's not registering in how a significant share of this community feels about the recovery in their lives.
Where are you going to go next with this data?
So we're going to, one of the next steps we want to take forward with it, we have a report based on this survey, which was fielded July of this year. And by the way, we have some information on it that'll be available, some summaries, along with a link to where you can access the data and the full report online. But one of the next things we want to carry forward as we get this data out there is we want to highlight not just what we've talked about today, disparities and divisions within New Orleans, but we also want to highlight disparities and divisions and perceptions between New Orleans and the rest of the state. We also surveyed the rest of Louisiana, and there are significant gaps in how the rest of Louisiana, even folks who experienced Katrina in a different way, Jefferson Parish, St. Tammany Parish, even folks who experienced Hurricane Rita have a much higher sense of recovery than you find in New Orleans and Plaquemines and St. Bernard.
Why do you think that is?
I think it has to do with the severity of the incident, because it's not just New Orleans. We also find that opinion about the status of recovery in Plaquemines Parish and St. Bernard Parish are right there, which itself is interesting, because if you had asked me before Hurricane Katrina if I ever would find public opinion data where St. Bernard and Plaquemines Parish were in agreement with Orleans Parish on anything, I would have never thought that would have happened. But on this issue, there is a commonality there in a perception of a limited recovery. The rest of the state seems much more ready to say, hey, we've done this.
So give us just a quick top of line before we close out, the top of line numbers. What are the numbers that you found in the research? Where can people go find it? Because I know now from this point it's not embargoed and you're going to be releasing it to media.
That's right, we're releasing it right now.
So perceptions of life is better, life is bad, different communities, what are some of the zinger numbers?
So overall in New Orleans, 50% of residents say we mostly recovered, 45% say mostly not recovered. Among white residents, it's 60% say, 78% say mostly recovered. Among African Americans, it's like 58% say mostly not recovered. The survey, all these data and the report is available at www.lsu.survey. Wait, I got that wrong. www.survey.lsu.edu.
Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Henderson, Research Director of the LSU Public Policy Research Lab. Thanks very much for joining us. Thank you.